Hi, my name is Katie, and for my final observation of human communications project, I decided to interview my mom. My mom had a friend who was also her classmate back in fourth grade who was deaf. Her classmate was Fred. Fred moved to Ontonagon, Michigan, which is where my mom grew up. He moved to Ontonagon when my mom was in third grade, and also when Fred was in third grade, he was placed in foster care. He lived there for about a year and a half. Fred was born deaf. His parents decided to put him into foster care because he was deaf. They didn't want to learn how to communicate with him. They didn't want to learn sign language. It was too much of a communication barrier for them, so they decided to put him into foster care. Um, so one of the things I asked my mom is how Fred's communication barrier affected you, and she said one of the big things was that trying to understand him and for her to understand him. One thing, he wasn't very good at reading lips, and my mom didn't know sign language, so they had a huge communication barrier because the two of them couldn't communicate with each other very well. It was often with gestures or pointing towards things, and if you couldn't understand what he wanted, he would get frustrated after repeating himself over and over again. Um, a personal story my mom has of that was one time Fred came over to her house to play, and she could understand what he wanted to play. She asked her mom to come in and ask Fred what he wanted to play, and even my grandma couldn't understand what Fred wanted. They ended up having to go back home to Fred's home to his foster mom to understand what he wanted to play because of that communication barrier. Um, Fred's communication barrier affected others around them because Fred would often get upset when people couldn't understand what he was saying or what he wanted. So a lot of people would try to not communicate with Fred because he would just get frustrated with them. So he wouldn't want to communicate with others, and others wouldn't want to communicate with him just because either Fred would grow frustrated or the people trying to communicate with him would grow frustrated. Um, People would treat Fred differently because of that, because of the social and communication barrier of being deaf. People wouldn't want to make friends with him because they couldn't communicate like how you normally would. So oftentimes it was hard for him to make friends. He was often alone at recess time. Um, Along with being deaf, Fred also had the social barrier of being the foster child. He got placed in foster care when he was in third grade and was in foster care for about a year and a half. So he never really had a set pair of parents who were willing to work with him and his communication disorder. I guess not really communication disorder, communication barrier because he was deaf. He didn't have parents who wanted to learn sign language. His foster parents didn't know sign language. Nobody in the school knows sign language. So in a way, he had two communication barriers. He had not having anybody there supporting him, so he didn't have that family parent love, and he also had the being deaf aspect. My mom has told me that Fred's communication helped her grow because she learned that you have to be more patient with somebody, especially when they speak a different language or sign a different language. And that there's more than one way to communicate with somebody, and you just have to be patient and find that way. So after doing the interview, I went and did a little bit more research on, excuse me, on deaf education and just deaf community in general. One thing that I found is there's two main ways of teaching children who are deaf. There is mainstreaming students, and there is also center-based or inclusion programs. Center-based and inclusion programs are usually the same. Mainstreaming is where the child goes to a hearing school, is in a normal classroom setting, normal teacher, normal, your typical hearing, normal school. They just go to them, and then they often have just a little bit of help or tools, such as note takers, sometimes translators. So they do have the tools, but they're usually based in a normal classroom. With the other type, the center-based and inclusion programs, they are usually in a different school. It's a school that can specialize in deaf hearing or deaf children. So oftentimes there'll be all deaf students with a deaf teacher. They have a lot more tools to cater to being deaf versus being hearing in a hearing school. Another thing I found really interesting was that schooling for the deaf started to take a really big change between 1970 and 1980. My mom met Fred when she was in fourth grade, and when my mom was in fourth grade, that was 1979 to 1980, around. And that is when deaf children started to get more opportunities in schooling, more help. Um, but the problem with where my mom and Fred went to, they went to a very, very small school. They lived in a small town where some of these programs and all these tools just weren't available to them. And of course, it was starting to be the really big breakthrough where schools were really starting to push, tools for other people with disabilities. So Fred didn't get the help that he could have. And I think he really would have benefited from all that help that he could have gotten if he would have had the mainstreaming or even the center-based inclusion programs. If he would have had the tools of a translator or like a note taker, I think he really would have benefited in fourth grade. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I think Fred being in a small town really did affect him because he didn't get the extra help learning, and I think he really could have benefited. Another thing that I learned while doing my research is that deaf is its own culture. It meets all 5 sociological criteria of being its own culture. And to me, I personally thought that was really cool because not only is it it's being deaf is a communication barrier in a hearing world, but when you're in a deaf community, you're not a communication barrier at all. You're just fine. And I thought that was one of the coolest things ever. So over this project, I really did learn a lot. I did learn a little bit about deaf culture throughout my research. I wish I could have met Fred himself and talked to him, but both me and my mom were unfortunately not able to find him. I do hope that Fred got better schooling. I know my mom said he was only in Ontonagon for about a year and a half when he moved out. He got switched to another foster care, and I really do hope that he got some better schooling opportunities and more people to work with him. Overall, I would say that this project really made me learn that not everybody is willing to work with people with communication barriers. Sometimes not even your own parents are willing to work with that. And I thought that was really sad, and also to just see that Fred was giving up into foster care because he was deaf. I just thought that deaf people can teach us a lot. They're really good at reading people emotionally. They see a lot of things. And I think one other thing that really stuck out to me with this project is that Fred seemed to get misunderstood by people often. They used to think he was just an aggressive person, but really he would just get frustrated because nobody was understanding him because of that communication barrier. And I think if he had better tools and better help, or he didn't have such a big communication barrier, I think people would have been more friendly towards him and willing to be friends with him. So overall, I feel like I learned a lot from this project and communication barriers.